As a behavioral economist, a lot of what we try to examine are essentially the mistakes people make in their lives and how that affects their choices. Food ends up being a very good target, if you will, for looking at such things, because a lot of the time we end up regretting what we've eaten, or at the very least regretting sort of the accumulated effects over a long period of time of a pattern of eating. And so really what we want to do is sort of drive down and figure out, why are we making bad decisions? Why are we doing things that are wrong? And what sorts of things can affect that? Well, one of the primary reasons, and our previous speaker alluded to it, is just the sheer number of decisions that we make. We make hundreds of food decisions every day, not just, when we're going to eat or how much we're going to eat, but what we're going to eat, what sorts of things we might decide to buy and keep in the home. You go into your average grocery store, and grocery stores account for, in the U.S. anyway, more than 60% of what we eat. And look at all the varieties, right? You look there's 285 varieties of cookies. How are you ever going to decide which cookie you're actually going to buy, right? There are just too many different ones for you to actually try them all and to figure out which one is going to taste the best given the sort of cost and also the calorie count that they have or whatever else you might care about. And so without being able to put all of that information together and take care of this in sort of a rational and systematic way, we start falling back on things like rules of thumb, we start falling back on habits, and we start latching on to, information that you might consider sort of unimportant, right? If you were to sit down and think about it for, reasonably. We start looking at things that really shouldn't matter in the end. So let me get a little further into that. Oftentimes we think about different policies and different, diets people try to follow, and they tend to fail. And there are a few different reasons why they fail. One of the key policies that's now being put into place nationwide in the U.S. is requiring calorie postings within the fast food industry. And requiring those calorie postings, the whole idea was if people had the information, they'd make better decisions, and they would recognize that they shouldn't take the really high-calorie stuff. But if you go back and look at all the studies coming out on this, it had almost no effect, in fact, no detectable effect, in almost all of those studies on the amount of calories people are actually consuming. One big exception to that was one study that showed that people who were on a diet were actually taking in more calories. Right? And what's going on there? Well, if you're on a diet and you're at a fast food restaurant, you've gone off your diet. And so suddenly, those calorie postings mean something very, very different to you. So one reason why a lot of these things fail is what economists call endogeneity. Essentially, the things that we want to curtail are exactly those things that we want. Okay? So it's, we want to cut back on the foods that we desire the most. And we would like, as a policymaker, you might think, to cut back on the foods and get those people to stop eating foods who want it the most. Those are the most likely to resist that type of aversion to the food. They're the most likely to try and defeat that policy, and that makes it very difficult. Another reason that some of these policies and some of these diets fail is reactance. Reactance is really any sort of rebellion against a threat to your freedom, right? And I've got a couple of good examples of this. One is just anecdotal, but I like sharing it. It's from a school nearby where I do my research, where they, in order to try and reduce the amount of added sugars that kids were taking in, they decided to limit them to 1 packet of ketchup with their lunch, right? And if you've ever had lunch, you've had fries or tater tots or something like that at a school, you can't cover very many of those with 1 packet of ketchup. And so the kids were sort of angry at this. Angry enough that they decided to throw this protest. And the protest was something very, very simple. The seniors, when they graduated, they walk across the stage and they shake the hand of the principal, and they hand him a packet of ketchup, each one of them. So that he had a full pocket full of packets of ketchup by the end of the day. And you think, well, that's not so bad. If that's the worst that happens, this isn't, we shouldn't worry that much about reactants. But consider what it means. What it means is if they care enough to throw that protest, then you haven't really captured their minds or their hearts. And when they get to a situation where they have plenty of packets of ketchup available, like a McDonald's, they're not just saying, well, those nice people at the school said I should just take one, so I'm only going to take one. Instead, they're saying free at last and grabbing handfuls and handfuls of that ketchup so it can defeat the purpose. More recently, we see, when Bloomberg started making his push for reducing soda sizes around New York City, you saw somewhat of a spike in the sales of particularly larger sizes of sodas. And even just showing a picture of Bloomberg while people are sitting around drinking soda leads them to drink a little bit more. They're pushing back on it. Okay. The final sort of point here that I want to make, sort of theoretically, if you will, is attribution. This idea that when I make a decision, I own that decision, and I start to value the outcome of that decision a little bit more. And so, another little illustration of this, we ran a neat little study where we had a little over 200 kids that were in a camp program that was actually on the campus of Cornell. And we brought them in, and we divided them up into two different groups, and half of them were given carrots with their lunch. The other half were given the choice between carrots and celery. And it wasn't much of a choice. A large number of the kids, almost all of them chose the carrots because, well, they're not celery. But what you found was very, very interesting. The kids who were given the choice, more of them ate carrots than the kids who were just given the carrots, right? So you're given the choice of celery, more of them eat carrots than if they have no choice and all they get are the carrots. Why? Because they had to sit down and they had to think, which one do I like more? And by having to reason through that, they started to value those carrots a bit more, and they ate them. It's about 15% more that ate the carrots when they had that choice. So that choice actually ends up making a difference, the fact that they could choose. So, I said when we start making these decisions, we're doing sort of rapid fire through the day, making our food decisions, we start latching on to information that really shouldn't make much difference. Let me give you a good example of that. What about soda size? Okay, if we look, there are a large variety of sizes of soda that are called a normal size of soda. A lot of people will think that 12-ounce soda can is probably about the right size. It's probably about normal or the regular size. If you go to a McDonald's in the U.S., that 12-ounce is the kid's size. If you look back historically, I've got this old picture that floats around the internet where they have these 12-ounce cans of soda advertised as king size, containing 2 full servings, right? Same thing with coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, but you can go to Starbucks and your 12 ounces is a tall, and you go to McDonald's and that 12 ounces is your small. So what does this mean? What is it doing to us, and how does that information impact us? Well, we ran a couple of experiments. Some where we had 2 different sizes of a whole bunch of different items, and sometimes we would refer to the smaller size as the half and the larger size as the regular, and though they were exactly the same size, with other groups we'd refer to the smaller size as the regular and the larger as the double, just to see what would happen, right? And there are a few things that happened. One, people were more willing to pay for larger sounding sizes, right? Which shouldn't surprise us too much, and they could see these before they actually paid or told us how much they were willing to pay. But the other thing you find is it affected how much they ate, right? When we call it a larger size, right, when we call it the double, they're leaving those red bars on their plate after they're done. And when we tell them it's the regular, right, they're leaving those blue bars on their plate. So in other words, they're seeing how much is on their plate, they're eating it, they know how full they're getting. We actually told them how much was on their plate. But even so, saying it's a double versus saying it's a regular had a pretty big impact on how much they walked away having eaten. That's ended up being about 140 calorie difference in one meal, right, just from calling it something larger. And this is actually an interesting point, because this says, Here there's a potential for a win-win where we can call something larger, people are willing to pay a little bit more for it, and they eat a little bit less of the meal that's there. And so it potentially benefits both the restaurant and the consumer. That doesn't look very good. Okay, so let's move on. Another sort of implication that, while I don't want to say that we are completely mindless in the way that we eat. We put our mind into it. We just put it in there in a very strange way, okay? And often we make mistakes. So, for example, if you talk to an economist, this is an example they use in intro econ classes everywhere. The idea that you go into an all-you-can-eat restaurant, right? You've already paid. How much you paid has no effect now on how much you enjoy the meal that's there. You should continue eating until that next bite of food provides you no more enjoyment. Okay, that's what an economist tells you you should do. That's what they call rational. Okay, but instead, we tend to eat to get our money's worth, right? So instead of thinking, I'm going to eat until this isn't very enjoyable anymore, we sit there and think, should I have another piece of pizza? Well, how much did I pay, right? How much do I need to eat in order to make this a worthwhile venture to have him come here? So we go to a restaurant and half the people coming in are given a free drink, the other half a free drink and half off the meal. The people who paid more ate, about 30% more on average than those who didn't, which is a pretty big amount. But here's the kicker. If you're eating to get your money's worth, it implies some other sort of strange behavior. So people who rated the food as not being very good, people who didn't like it, when we look within the sample, ate about a half slice more of pizza on average. That's 100 some odd calories, probably 150 calories. Okay, why? What's going on? Well, if you like it less, right? It takes a lot more bad pizza than good to get your money's worth, right? So you're driven to eat more based on what you sort of thought you should be getting out of this experience. And very often, that's going to be the case, that those foods that taste a little bit better, you might be able to rein yourself in a little bit more having had a satisfying experience. Okay? So the idea that a lot of behavioral economists sort of toss around now is this idea that really there are two different decision mechanisms. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but the idea that if we are, in a cold state, if we're not distracted, we're really thinking about things, we aren't very hungry, then we think through things and we think about health information, we think about price trade-offs, and we make very good decisions. But if not, if we're really hungry, or if we're distracted by conversation or by a TV or whatever it might be, then we get put into this more hot state, where we don't think through things that way. Instead, we think through things in a way that sort of goes haywire. And oftentimes, we're only going to seek after things that are really hedonic, things that really taste good, really high in salt, fat, and sugar, or things that, bigger portions, right? Testing this with kids, we actually went to a bunch of schools, and here you have this kid making a decision on a smart board. Half of these kids were allowed to make their decision for their meal, what they were going to eat at lunch, in the morning, when they had just eaten breakfast, and they weren't very distracted, and potentially in a cold state, while the others had to wait until they were actually there in line to make this decision, when they could see all the foods, they could smell all the foods, and they had, it'd been several hours since they'd eaten. And what do you find? Well, the students who did not pre-order, those who were sort of in this hot state, if you will, they ate about 12% less fruit on average, and about 9% more snack food, and about 25% more starchy sides like your French fries or potato chips or tater tots, right? So this hot versus cold is something very important. And the key here is really, we sort of take this from a general notion of this dual process model, but hunger can be one of these things that leads you to the hot state. Well, if you're in a cold state and you're not hungry, you're deciding not to eat. So if we're going to try and reach people who are eating in changing their behavior, we've got to learn to talk to the hot state decision maker. We can't simply tell people to put their mind into it. We need to try and find some way to talk to people whose mind is out of it in some way, all right? Those are the people we really need to address. So here's some rocket science. We had a grocery store chain down in New Mexico that wanted to figure out what they could do to sort of help people to buy more produce, okay? And we went down there and we worked with them. And the idea we had was simply, you ever hear the Clash song, "I'm all lost in a supermarket"? We wanted to help people find their way. So we simply put an arrow on the ground pointing to the produce, okay? That's what we did. And you can see pictures of these arrows. They were about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide, and it wasn't the best graphic in the world because, we didn't have a huge budget. What happened? You put the arrow on the ground, and suddenly you have a 10% jump in fruit sales, okay? You have about a 9.5% jump in vegetable sales, and you have about a 5% jump in WIC redemptions. If you don't know what WIC is, this is a program in the U.S. that provides, some specific foods for women with children who are sort of lower income. And so what this was is something really great for the store. Now, overall, those 9% increases were essentially drawing money from other parts of the store, right? It was held flat, so it wasn't like we were seeing an increase in total sales, but now we're seeing an increase in high margin sales of these perishable items relative to other items in the store that could sit on the shelves forever, right? And so it was something the store really liked. And in fact, they decided to redesign the arrows so they look nice and roll these out in the rest of their stores, right? Another problem we have really is trying to figure out how to speak to kids. And the problem we've had is most of the efforts out there trying to get kids to eat nutritiously have done something along the lines of arguing that carrots have beta carotene in it, okay? Or that we need to have, certain, you need to be in certain bands of calorie consumption and things like that. And arguing about the health implications on down the road. And, we talk about that hot state, cold state. Well, if you've had kids, they're basically in a hot state all the time. And you also know that they're very unconcerned with health implications for when they turn 50. Okay, it's just not something that enters into their mind. And so trying to talk to them that way doesn't work very well. But saying something like, look, this is cool, that actually can work pretty well. So here's a neat little study we had published. Again, this is a group that was in for lunch, and they were given the choice with their lunch. They could take an apple or they could take a cookie, right? And we provided the apples and the cookies. And baseline, not doing anything to it, about 90% took the cookie. And I suppose that's not a surprise. And about 20% took this apple, okay? Which, again, is not too out of line with what we'd expect. A lot of kids don't eat fruit, and a lot of kids don't eat vegetables. In fact, the statistics on that are rather astounding in the U.S. Do something very simple. Put a little sticker on the apple that has a picture of Elmo's face, right? You get a 70% jump in those taking that apple. And those taking that apple ended up eating that apple. If we do the same thing to the cookie, right? If we put Elmo's face on that cookie, nothing happens. Why? Well, nothing. You see, there's actually a slight decrease with Elmo's face on there. It's insignificant, of course, it's 0. What's going on? Well, the kid knows the cookie's for them. They've had the cookie. They've seen cookies all over the place, and every time people have kids over and they want to do something nice for them, they're making cookies, and they've been told over and over again, these cookies are for you, and they're cool, and they taste good, okay? The apple it has a public image problem, if you will, among kids, right? They need some way of telling the kid, look, this is for you. This is something exciting, something you can get into. And in fact, we see this in a lot of other realms. When we give vegetables cool names, right? Things that sound interesting, like X-ray vision carrots, okay, instead of just carrots. We see this big jump, right? And again, it ends up being something along the lines of that 70% jump. And when we do it in schools, it sticks around and it stays for over a semester in length, right? So it's something very simple in that environment where they're distracted. This type of information means something. This type of information actually speaks to them and gets them to change their mind on what it is they're going to eat. So I want to just go over one last experiment that shows sort of how this can work on a large scale. And some of you, at least, are probably aware of the changes that have been made in the U.S. school lunch program. The school lunch program changed. They started requiring a lot healthier foods. Every kid had to have a fruit or vegetable on their tray in order to qualify for the reduced prices that they offer. And there were a whole bunch of other sort of intricate changes that I won't go into that have to do with, fat and other things like that. The big worry with this new program was that, the kids wouldn't like the healthier food, that they'd push back, and that they might throw a lot of it away, right? Particularly when you're requiring the fruit or vegetable on the tray, you can require it on the tray, you can't require it in the belly, right? And so they might just decide, well, thanks, but no thanks, and pitch it. So we went into a large school district in the U.S. We actually had hundreds of schools participating, and we did two things. In a couple of different treatments, one just implemented those new USDA guidelines, and so we were able to compare before and after what happened with those schools. And another set implemented both the guidelines and a set of other changes that we sort of recommend with schools. One, we would move the fruit out of the stainless steel bins and into these baskets near the cash register that sort of look attractive, right? We would name the healthier foods. We gave them attractive names sort of to attract kids to them. We used signs that were sort of vibrant, that looked a little bit more like a fast food restaurant than an institutional setting, right? And we put the white milk in places where it was a little bit more visible. What happened? Well, on the right, you have here where, essentially the change in waste in the schools that implemented the guidelines. Blue is fruit, the red is vegetables. And essentially what you're seeing there is waste doubled. In fact, on average, you get about 1 out of 10 kids that are now eating a fruit or vegetable that wasn't before, and you get about 3 out of 10 that are now throwing away a fruit or vegetable that weren't before. Okay, so a lot of waste. But when you implement those changes, that waste virtually disappears. We find something that's essentially an insignificant change in the amount of waste, which means those kids are now eating those fruits and vegetables because they were motivated to. So I suppose the bottom line to me is we don't just need to deal with availability, we need to deal with motivation, and that motivation means they are actually, deciding they want to eat these fruits and vegetables. That's where we need to work on this, working on those mindless eaters, if you will. So conclusions. So I've shown you a bunch of things that I think behavioral tools can do, but I think there are some real limits to it. Number one, I think we can really only generally tap into latent desires that are already there. So if they don't have a desire to eat this at any level, there's nothing we can do aside from try and, talk to them. But as long as that desire is there, I think we can tap into it using this sort of method. If we're dealing with policy or culture or things like that, we've got to be really careful not to inflame whoever it is that we're trying to change, right? If we move in a way that cooperates and makes producers and consumers happy, they feel good about it, right? Whereas if you move in a way that makes them feel like you're restricting them or beating up on them, then they tend to get angry and try to defeat that policy, and it becomes a lot harder for that policy to succeed. And final point, and back to that, that one example with the names of sizes, this means also that there are some potential win-win solutions. There are some ways in which the producers and consumers can both win by using these tools, because neither are completely effectively using the information that's out there. And I will quit there. Thank you.